Charles Caldwell was born into slavery in Mississippi, in a world designed to keep him silent, invisible, and obedient. He entered life with no legal rights, no protection under the law, and no guarantee of survival beyond the next sunrise. Yet from those conditions, something extraordinary began to form. Not power, not privilege, but resolve. This is not a story about luck. It is a story about refusal. Refusal to accept ignorance as destiny. Refusal to believe that chains defined worth. Refusal to stay quiet when silence was safer. Long before Charles Caldwell ever held political office, he understood a dangerous truth. Knowledge was freedom's first weapon. Teaching himself to read and write was an act of quiet rebellion in a society that punished black literacy as a threat. Skilled labor gave him a measure of independence. But it was his voice, clear, steady, and fearless, that made him truly dangerous to the old order. After the Civil War, America promised a new beginning. Laws were rewritten. Amendments were passed. Freedom was declared. But on the ground, violence still ruled. For many formerly enslaved people, Reconstruction was not a celebration, it was a test of survival. Charles Caldwell chose to step forward anyway. He entered politics not for comfort, but for responsibility. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. At a time when black leadership was answered with intimidation, Caldwell stood in public spaces, defended the right to vote, and believed against all evidence that justice could still matter. And for that belief, he would become a target. In today's video, we uncover the untold story of a man the system tried and failed to break. A man whose courage exposes a forgotten chapter of American history, and whose life still speaks to the meaning of resistance today. If stories like this matter to you, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with others. These histories deserve to be remembered and heard. The man who once learned to read in silence now stood at the center of a courtroom where every eye told him the same thing. This was not a place built for him to survive. Mississippi courts had never been safe spaces for black men, especially when a white life was involved. The law existed, but it rarely applied evenly. And yet, on that day, Charles Caldwell walked into the room not as a frightened defendant, but as a man who understood exactly what was at stake, not only for himself, but for every newly freed citizen watching from the shadows of Reconstruction. The incident itself unfolded quickly, sparked by confrontation and fueled by the volatile tension of a society struggling to accept change. A white, the son of a respected judge, fired first. Caldwell reacted in self-defense, and the outcome was irreversible. In the Old South, the story would have ended there. No trial, no questions, no mercy. But Reconstruction had cracked the door open. Just barely. And Caldwell stepped through it. What followed was unprecedented. An all-white jury listened as a black man spoke in his own defense. Not as property, not as a subordinate, but as a citizen under the law. The room was heavy with disbelief. Many expected the verdict before the trial even began. Yet, against custom and expectation, the jury acquitted him. For a brief moment, the promise of Reconstruction felt real. That verdict echoed far beyond the courthouse walls. For black communities, it was a fragile signal that the law might, under rare conditions, offer protection. For white supremacists, it was an alarm. Caldwell had crossed a line they believed could never be crossed. He had survived a legal system designed to erase him. And worse, he had done so publicly. This was the moment Charles Caldwell transformed from a respected local leader into a symbol of dangerous possibility. His acquittal did not make him safer. It made him visible. It proved that education, composure, and courage could disrupt centuries of enforced hierarchy. It also confirmed the fears of those determined to restore the old order by any means necessary. Caldwell understood the cost. He did not celebrate recklessly or retreat into silence. Instead, he leaned further into public life, convinced that the law, however fragile, was worth defending while it still existed. He entered politics knowing full well that every speech, every vote, every appearance increased the risk. But for him, survival without purpose was not freedom at all. Reconstruction was not simply a political error. It was a narrow window where justice briefly challenged tradition. Caldwell's trial stood as one of its clearest examples. The law worked not because the system was suddenly fair, but because it was temporarily constrained by federal oversight and constitutional change. That constraint would not last. Those who opposed Reconstruction took careful note. They learned that if courts could not be fully controlled, then fear would do the work instead. Ballots would be suppressed, voices would be threatened, and leaders like Caldwell would be isolated. His acquittal became a turning point not toward progress, but toward retaliation. Still, Caldwell refused to disappear. He carried himself with the quiet certainty of a man who had already faced the worst and survived. He believed that if the law could protect one black man once, it could do so again. That belief would guide him into the Senate, into the heart of Mississippi's political struggle, and ultimately, into history. For a fleeting moment, Charles Caldwell proved that Reconstruction was not a myth. It was real, it was fragile, and it terrified those who thrived on inequality. And for that reason alone, they would never forgive him. By the time Charles Caldwell took his seat in the Mississippi State Senate, he already knew that the courtroom victory which had spared his life had also sealed his fate. Survival had come with a cost. He was no longer just a man who had defended himself under the law. He had become living proof that the old rules were weakening. In a state still haunted by the collapse of slavery, that made him intolerable to those who wished to turn the clock back. Caldwell entered public office during a moment of fragile possibility. Reconstruction had rewritten the Constitution, and on paper, the nation had committed itself to equality before the law. The 14th Amendment promised citizenship and equal protection. The 15th promised the right to vote regardless of race. To many, these words felt distant and abstract. To Caldwell, they were tools meant to be used, enforced, and defended in the open. He understood that political power was the difference between freedom that existed only in theory and freedom that could be lived. Voting rights were not simply about casting ballots. They were about deciding whose voices mattered and whose futures would be shaped by law rather than intimidation. Caldwell worked tirelessly to protect black suffrage, even as organized efforts grew to prevent newly freed citizens from approaching the polls. Each election season brought rumors, warnings, and carefully worded threats, all designed to remind him that participation had a price. Public education stood at the center of his vision. Having risked everything to become literate, Caldwell believed that schools were the foundation of true independence. Education meant more than reading and writing. It meant the ability to understand contracts, laws, and rights that had once been deliberately withheld. He pushed for a system of public schooling that would serve all children, knowing full well that an educated population could no longer be easily controlled. For his opponents, this was one of his most dangerous ideas. Every step forward was met with resistance. Armed groups patrolled towns. Newspapers used language meant to inflame fear. Political gatherings became tense, unpredictable spaces where words alone could trigger violence. Yet Caldwell refused to retreat into caution. He appeared at rallies, spoke plainly to crowds, and insisted that disagreement should be settled through debate rather than force. He believed that if democracy was to survive, it had to be practiced even under pressure. The enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments became a constant battle, rather than a settled achievement. Local officials often ignored federal law, and state institutions quietly undermined it. Caldwell used his position to expose these contradictions, pressing for accountability in a system that preferred silence. His speeches were not fiery performances. They were deliberate, grounded in law, and impossible to dismiss without confronting the Constitution itself. As threats mounted, colleagues urged caution. Some advised him to lower his profile, to choose survival over confrontation. Caldwell listened, but he did not change course. He understood that withdrawal would signal defeat, not only for himself but for those who believed in the promises of Reconstruction. He remained visible because invisibility had never protected anyone like him. In those years, the Mississippi Senate was not merely a legislative chamber. It was a front line. Caldwell stood there knowing that the protection of the law was temporary and uneven, yet still worth defending while it existed. He was not driven by the illusion of safety, but by the conviction that progress, however fragile, demanded witnesses willing to stand in its path. Caldwell's time in office did not end in triumph, but it left a record of courage that could not be erased. He showed that leadership during Reconstruction was not about comfort or longevity. It was about standing long enough to make the promises of the Constitution visible, even as the forces gathering against him made clear that those promises would soon be tested and broken. The fragile promise of Reconstruction in Mississippi was constantly under siege, and nowhere was this more violently apparent than in the events surrounding the 1875 Clinton massacre, an orchestrated campaign of terror aimed at silencing black voices and dismantling Republican influence. Charles Caldwell, by then a seasoned state senator, had already endured the threats and intimidation common to any African-American leader daring to exercise political power in the Deep South. Yet the scale and brutality of this attack revealed just how far the opposition was willing to go. In the early autumn, a seemingly ordinary Republican rally at Moss Hill, an abandoned plantation outside Clinton, quickly spiraled into chaos when white agitators, strategically positioned, began to provoke the crowd and incite violence. Despite Caldwell's efforts to mediate and maintain peace, the meeting devolved into a hail of gunfire, leaving innocent black men, women, and even children dead or gravely wounded. The intent was clear: to instill terror, to send a message that African Americans asserting their rights would pay the ultimate price. News of the massacre spread rapidly, echoing through the small towns and plantations of Hinds County, signaling a grim pattern repeated across the state where militias and white supremacist groups operated with near impunity, often dragging men from their homes or ambushing gatherings in broad daylight. Even attempts at legal recourse or appeals for federal intervention were met with bureaucratic hesitation, as letters between Governor Adelbert Ames and President Ulysses Grant reveal a reluctance to commit federal forces unless rebellion threatened state authority itself. Amid this orchestrated climate of fear, Caldwell's leadership became both a beacon of resilience and a direct target. He mobilized local black militias to protect vulnerable communities, deliver arms, and demonstrate that African Americans would not surrender their hard-won political voice. Yet each act of defense drew sharper threats and greater scrutiny from those determined to restore white dominance. The 1875 election further exemplified this perilous landscape. Democrats sought to suppress black voter turnout through intimidation, yet Caldwell's insistence on standing firm and encouraging participation underscored a profound courage. Knowing that defiance could and ultimately would cost lives, the systematic nature of the violence, meticulously planned and executed by both mobs and organized militias, reflected a chilling strategy to exploit fear, fracture community cohesion, and erase black representation from public office. Within this landscape, Caldwell's story illuminates the stark reality that Reconstruction was not merely a legislative experiment but a battleground, where the rights of newly freed citizens were enforced only as long as courage, vigilance, and organized resistance could withstand the pervasive force of racial terror. Even as bullets rained and families were torn apart, Caldwell's resolve exemplified the indomitable spirit required to resist oppression, highlighting the deadly stakes of black political engagement and the relentless efforts to quash progress in Mississippi and beyond. As the brutal violence of the Clinton massacre and other attacks across Mississippi unfolded, the limitations of federal authority became painfully evident, revealing how tenuous the protections of Reconstruction truly were. Governor Adelbert Ames, recognizing the scale of the threat, sought assistance from President Ulysses Grant, detailing the systematic assaults carried out by white militias and the widespread intimidation of African American communities. Yet the responses he received underscored a sobering reality. The federal government was hesitant to commit troops unless a full-scale rebellion threatened state sovereignty, leaving black citizens and Republican leaders dangerously exposed. This reluctance emboldened the perpetrators, signaling that the defense of African American rights could no longer rely on distant authority, but must be shouldered locally, often at tremendous risk. In towns like Clinton and surrounding counties, the absence of federal intervention allowed organized militias and mobs to operate with near total impunity, executing murders, looting homes, and terrorizing entire communities without fear of immediate legal consequences. Families lived under constant threat, and African American leaders like Charles Caldwell had to navigate a landscape where political engagement was a direct challenge to life and property. Despite his courage and the temporary successes of black political organization, the weight of coordinated oppression proved overwhelming, as these militias systematically dismantled Republican infrastructure, ensuring that elections were swayed through fear rather than fair democratic processes. The chilling effectiveness of this strategy was magnified by widespread acquiescence from local law enforcement and judicial systems, which often turned a blind eye or actively supported the violence, reinforcing the cycle of intimidation and disenfranchisement. As African American citizens sought to exercise their newly granted rights under the 14th and 15th Amendments, they found themselves confronted not only by mobs but by an indifferent or hostile state apparatus, revealing that the promise of Reconstruction could be nullified when commitment at the highest levels of government wavered. In this environment, Caldwell's leadership became an act of extraordinary defiance, as he organized militias, protected voters, and persisted in public service despite knowing that the federal shield he once relied upon was insufficient. The ultimate consequence of this failure was the rapid erosion of Reconstruction gains in Mississippi, as white supremacist forces regained political control and imposed measures that would suppress African American participation for decades. Through this lens, the story of Charles Caldwell is not just one of personal bravery, but also a stark illustration of how the absence of sustained federal enforcement allowed systemic racial oppression to reassert itself, effectively ending the fragile experiment of Reconstruction in the state. His life and work stand as a testament to the courage required to resist entrenched power, and the devastating consequences when that courage alone cannot overcome the broader failure of national support, leaving communities to face the brutal realities of unchecked racial terror. On Christmas Day in 1875, Charles Caldwell's life was tragically cut short in a meticulously planned ambush that shook Mississippi and resonated across the nation. A grim reminder of the dangers faced by African American leaders during Reconstruction. What began as a simple invitation from a supposed friend, Buck Cabell, to share a Christmas toast quickly transformed into a deadly trap, as assassins lay in wait to silence a man who had never wavered in his commitment to justice and equality. Caldwell, ever dignified even in the face of imminent death, reportedly confronted his attackers with remarkable courage, insisting that when they killed him, they killed a gentleman and a brave man, not a coward. His words reflected the essence of his life, a life defined not by fear but by unwavering resistance against oppression. The ambush did not spare his family or community. His brother and other black men in the vicinity were killed or gravely wounded, illustrating the indiscriminate nature of the violence and the lengths to which white supremacist forces would go to dismantle black political power. Despite the public horror and the testimonies collected in subsequent investigations, no one was ever convicted for the murders, a testament to the systemic failure of justice when it came to protecting African Americans. Caldwell's assassination became more than a personal tragedy. It symbolized the violent erosion of democracy and the suppression of black political rights in Mississippi. The brief promise of Reconstruction, where African Americans could vote, hold office, and assert their rights under the law, was systematically dismantled through terror, intimidation, and the complicity of a government unwilling or unable to intervene decisively. Yet, even in death, Caldwell's legacy endured. His courage, leadership, and commitment to justice inspired others to continue the fight for equality, serving as a powerful reminder that progress often comes at a steep price. As we reflect on his story today, it is a call to remember those who risked everything to advance civil rights, and a stark illustration of how fragile hard-won freedoms can be in the face of hatred and violence. Charles Caldwell's life and sacrifice stand as an enduring testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be silenced, and to the necessity of vigilance, courage, and collective action in the ongoing struggle for justice. Thank you for watching this exploration of Caldwell's extraordinary story. If his life and legacy moved you, please support our channel by liking this video, sharing it with friends and family, and subscribing so we can continue to uncover and honor the untold heroes of history. Your engagement helps keep these important stories alive and ensures that the lessons of the past continue to inspire the present.